Hey, good morning. How you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Oh, doing good.
Good. Before we hit record, we were just talking a little bit about sort of where we've left things, and we've got some new material coming up in terms of hopefully Claudia is feeling well this week, and we're going to record another episode with her. But just to kind of flesh out some of the material that we've touched on. I think there are two threads that could use a little more development. One is ethics, and what we mean by that, and why ethics is kind of rising to the the top of the various ways of looking at the emergence of new consciousness. And why do you believe ethics is so relevant? And then another, and I think related piece is to talk more about discourse or dialogue and how essential that is to, um, I mean, for one thing, refining the semantic models that we respectively have, the semantic worlds, or the cognitive models, or the hermeneutics, so that the the so that what we see is more and more relevant to objective reality or something like that, or
Uh-huh. Right.
truth. Um,
Yep. Yep.
so I think those are kind of two threads, and I'm just wondering where you might want to start with that.
Yeah. Well, I came across, as you were talking, probably four different places to start. Um, I think that our conversation has been following these different threads, and I I think that one of the reasons that it feels appropriate for me to end up with ethics is because I've always had a sense of the importance of what the Greeks called, and I think we spoke about it the other day, as a phronesis. And the phronesis idea is a special kind of practical wisdom that specifically addresses what do we do. And that's like my favorite piece by Tolstoy is called literally "What then do we do?" It's all about ethics, and he talks about trying to help the poor and him being a super rich guy and also being a Christian, and a wonderful piece. And I had written off Tolstoy because I was, of course, made to read War and Peace. I think I read Anna Karenina just as, in on principle. And I kind of thought of him as like a writer of novellas, like the Spanish novellas, kind of like, for people who don't know what a novella is, they're kind of like a flavor of Spanish soap operas. And I kind of thought of Tolstoy as a, period piece soap opera writer. It's the way I kind of saw War and Peace. And, but then when I read this, I was like, wow, I was blown away by his intellectual integrity. And the piece is called "What Then Do We Do? What Then Should We Do?" And, we've also mentioned recently John Dewey, a uniquely American philosopher who had a lot to do with education and had a lot of opinions about education. And he sort of talks about he has an interesting way of dividing things up into, the book that I'm reading now is currently called The Quest for Certainty. And he talks about, as we have spoken about here, the difference between, I think we spoke about it first with Plato, where it's like there's the world where everything happens, but then we distill out of it these ideas or ideals. And like we spoke about circularity and how circular things exist, but circularity is like timeless. And circularity, we might say that the perfect circle exists on the level of mind, but out here in reality, we deal with things that pass away, that arise and decline. And so the thing about the world of mind is that being timeless, it also can be certain. We know the mathematical relationship between this and that, like if you want to go into geometry or some geometry, the Greeks used as this pure form of mind so that it was this beautiful internal consistency. Uh, so But the thing about and this is what Dewey talks about, is he says, the reason that we do this, we extract it out of the everyday world, the world that is not certain, the world that where things arise and things pass away, and the world which is unpredictable because of that change, unlike this perfect sphere of mind. The world that we live in is probabilistic. It's not deterministic. In a perfect mathematical system in the mind, we can have all the factors and we can add it all up and we can come up with an answer that is the answer, certain for sure. But whenever we apply things in reality, we're leaping into this probabilistic realm where some things might happen and other things might happen. And that's why we have these pesky things like the law of unforeseen consequences. In mathematics, there's no law of unforeseen consequences.
Well, there's entropy and chaos theory, and I think mathematics and physics, try to go there. But so, are there not things that are purely mechanistic out here in the world, or deterministic? So let's say you're wanting to make your building square. We know how to use geometry to and write triangles to make sure that our walls are perpendicular to one another. Is the argument that perpendicularity is an ideal and we can never perfectly attain that?
Well, I think that's one dimension of the argument. The other argument is that, yeah, it's perpendicular today. Right? Because it's in the world of what the Buddhists would call dependent originations. It's perpendicular now because of certain causes and conditions. But given time, some of those causes and conditions are going to change, maybe, and some things might not be perpendicular given enough time. So, because in this world, some things are certain, and that's kind of where these things overlap. If mind couldn't apply and get the right answers sometimes, we would be truly lost. But it can't squash out that X factor. Uh, we have this idea that we call literally absurd. And absurd is the hanging over piece, the part that's not part of the integer, right? The leftover part is the surd. And we literally, the part that's left over that we can't finally catch and account for, there's always that leftover part. And the idea that we call it absurd is interesting because it somehow says that our reasonable methods can't catch it. It's just absurd. But it's to that extra part. It's to that. That's why I like the fact, we talked about this before, that this idea of infinity and infinity kind of being locked up in a circle. We've spoken about before also about the difference between a circle and a square, and the circle is considered spiritual or divine, and the square is material with the four elements. Well, one of the ways that that circle is divine is because the irrational is inside of it. Within its own relationship with itself is where we find pi.
The relationship between the diameter and the circumference
Right. And
and the area.
so
Yeah.
every circle will have that irrational seed stuck in it that we can never calculate. We can get closer and closer and closer, but we can never calculate it. It's infinite. Well, for Descartes, infinity was divine. It was sacred. This was the part which passes beyond all understanding. And so that's part of the association of the circle having this sacred component to it. Um, but also this infinity represented within it, even as a human. And I was thinking about this, and within white ceremonial magic, the consciousness of the magician is represented as the magical circle, not the magical square, right? There is a circle, there is a triangle that's used, outside of the circle. But that idea of a circle means that somehow inside of the very nature of this thing is the infinite and therefore the divine. So basically, there's this idea that within the realm of mental things, we can have this type of unchangeability and this type of certainty that in life, we will never have that kind of certainty. The irrational is always in there, written in there somehow, not just in circular things. In the very nature of the script is the incalculable infinity. In every coastline of Norway, right, is this incalculableness. And therein is the divine, a la Descartes, right? So a human in this being dangling between the beast and the gods, we have this sort of a relationship in consciousness with the infinite, the irrational, and that's part of the incalculability of the I.
It brings up a sort of image for me of like mankind looking in various places for meaning, looking at the material world, looking at the spiritual world, looking out there, and then looking internally into himself through psychology or meditation or
Right,
spiritual work. And now it's almost like you're proposing that men turn to one another and experience the infinite, or maybe that's what Levinas and some of these other guys were proposing, and you like that idea that
right.
that we can encounter the infinite and therefore the divine by more fully experiencing one another.
Yeah, and that's an aspect, and that it also through experiencing one another, we experience other aspects of ourself. So, for example, the thought thread that comes from this morning was, I was listening to Thomas Nagel deliver a lecture at Harvard, I think, and the general topic is this idea that comes from Kant of a priori intuitions. So, for Kant, the sensibilities around time and space are a priori intuitions. And I'm very interested in this idea of a priori intuitions, meaning there's not an obvious straight line to it through reason. It's an intuition. It's come from somewhere we don't know exactly where, and it's a priori. And by a priori, Kant meant that we come in with it as sort of a part of the apparatus of the capacity to understand the life that we're born into. We come with these intuitions of time and space. So that when we start to see this kaleidoscope, we kind of have an intuition to put it into a setting of time and space. But I think that just scratches the surface of a priori intuitions. And for example, I think there's great arguments to be made that we have an a priori intuition for meaning itself, and that we come preset with a certain type of hardware. And then the ethical component conversation is, do we have an a priori intuition around morality and ethics? And what Thomas Nagel was talking about, he was mentioning a colleague of his by the name of Hampshire who was in World War II. And he was sent to interrogate a member of the French resist the French not no not the French resistance, a collaborator in France. So the Allies had taken over, were in the process of taking over France again from the Germans. And they caught a French citizen who had been a collaborationist with the Nazis. And his job was to interrogate this guy and to get information that might well save lives on our side, but maybe on both sides. And so he went to interrogate this guy, and this is so much better than the trolley examples, right? And the guy has some information. He says, "But I'm not going to tell you unless you can see that I'm given over to the Americans instead of to the French resistance or whoever he was set to get." Because he knew that they would just put a bullet in his head because that's what they did with these people. It was not a long trial. And, uh, and so, this colleague of his, Hampshire, apparently was given that task, and so he was in a position where he coulda lied to the guy, and he coulda said, "Okay, I can do that, do you just tell me X, Y, and Z, and I'll see to it." But he, as an impulse in the moment, could not do that. And the argument is that there was an intuition of, now this is where what's called the consequentialist meets the deontologist. Okay. So the consequentialist idea that later gets formalized by Bentham and John Stuart Mill is that the final outcome of the most happiness and the least suffering is the ultimate determinant of what's moral and what's not moral. And then you have Kant and with this idea of what's called a categorical imperative. And that might be like you just don't kill. Or in this case, he's not going to give the guy the false hope of life when he's just a dead man walking. Uh, so so there's an interesting question. Where does that intuition towards a moral a choice, where does that come from?
Before we try to play with that question, can you explain what a consequentialist and what a deontologist are real quick?
Okay, so the consequentialist, later they get with Mill, it gets called utilitarianism. They do a kind of a calculus. Well, if this many people get happiness, this many people get pain or suffering or sadness, we're gonna do the calculus, and whatever gets us the net positive happiness, that's the moral thing to do. Whereas the deontology is the idea, it comes from the Greek word deontos, I believe it's deontos, which means duty. And so the idea is that just you don't if you knew that you could kill Hitler as a baby, you still don't do it because you don't kill babies. Because you just have a duty, a deontological duty to not kill babies because it's just a thing. Yeah, but baby Hitler, right? you know, and, there, and we go into science fiction scenarios or trolley car scenarios or things like that. But here's a real life situation, and one of the guys was maybe making the argument that there's slow think and fast think ways to run these problems, and that the fast think way to do it is that intuition in the moment that says, "No, I won't do this because I'm not somebody who does this because I have a duty to s- to God, to myself, to my ancestors, to whatever, that I just don't do that." And then the utilitarian approach is, well, I'm just going to do the math. But that's a slower approach. And remember, the
Uh,
idea that
the
the idea that
to do the math on what the consequences are of killing Hitler as a baby or not. So you can get some of the math of not killing him, but the math of killing him is entirely conjecture.
Well,
Like,
we're in this probabilistic world. And so the idea that might be made against one of the arguments, I'm sure this is it's not exhaustive, is that we're in a probabilistic world and we can't ever do that math. And so the best we really have is to follow our duty, and our duty is determined by this instinct or by is it and that's the question I have. How a priori is this instinct or this intuition to morality?
I had some debates with a friend. Shout out to Shale, who's like a hardcore evolutionary, um, like Darwinism explains all of this as far as he's concerned. So morality evolved because, if we don't kill babies, that tends to be good for the tribe. And
Yeah,
if we
yeah.
take care of one another, that tends to be good for the tribe, et cetera, et cetera. Like, all of ethics essentially boils down to increased survival rates.
Right, is reducible to right. And I know there's a name for that. And if there's a name for it, then there's a history of arguments for it and against it. It goes without saying, just the structure of the philosophical thought. Um, and it is I was thinking that it's probably something that's worth addressing in and of itself, this idea of reduction, which is uh, which is to say the idea that something thing A can be explained or reduced to thing B. Well, consciousness can be reduced to neurological activity, or morality can be reduced to, uh, in this case, evolutionary forces, right? I think that explains some, and it doesn't explain all of it. Uh, and I think the part that there's I'm trying to think of where else this typical situation has shown up, where sometimes a certain structure or arrangement serves a higher purpose and a lower purpose. And we can see the lower purpose and completely miss out on the higher purpose and decide that it's there for the lower purpose alone. And I think that evolution does that in a lot of ways, and that it does it to such a great degree. In fact, that's what I loved about David Hartley Neal's accusation about. I guess you would say it's about the Cartesian impulse that everything can be mathed. And he says it's basically a methodology that metastasized into a metaphysics. And this idea of it as a I think we've explained that as a methodology, science is basically anti-hermeneutical. Science really doesn't want you to be doing interpretation. It wants to stick with like the old cops in the Dragnet show, just the facts, ma'am. We're not interested in how the woman feels about the facts or how it relates to her history, or we just want the facts, ma'am. And his little notebook is not big enough for all the other details, all the n-dimensional details of the qualia of experience, right? We want to distill it down to certain things to which is a
His
certain
little notebook is not adequate for the infinite.
exactly. He would need a much longer pencil. and so at the same time, this scientific method is only good for hermeneutical tasks. And so when this metastasizes into a metaphysics, it looks like, oh, the subjective is of no value. And I think that this shows up,
I mean, this is sort of saying the subjective is of evolutionary value.
uh, and of no absolute value.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And so and yet this idea that once we put mind as fundamental, then everything sort of shifts in light of that. And, I think that that also changes that's why I'm interested to hear from Claudia more about the ethics that falls out of Levinas, because what I believe, and I don't know whether this is just my intuition or whether I've heard this before, but that it's this idea that the other actually presents us with an obligation, and that otherness, that there's actually an obligatory relationship there, and that becomes the foundation of ethical behavior. Uh, and I think that that's true, but I know there's a bigger story there.
Well, if it's true that there's an obligation, and which sounds like an a priori obligation,
Exactly, exactly.
then it must also be true that some people are capable of ignoring that, or not having a relationship with it.
Exactly. And that's why, one of the things, and again, I was hoping we'll get somebody here that can kind of make the arguments for him. John Stuart Mill has this idea that if we had a big enough computer that could crunch all the numbers and we could measure all the numbers, that is that we could predict people's behavior, which is to say that the another way of saying this is that this moment is completely and entirely dependent on conditions of the previous moment, and that there is absolutely nothing, no crack in there where will can intervene, and real choice can exist.
Yeah, meaning that will is also will in this moment is an outcome of all the other moments
All
before
these and that it's
it.
just an illusion to us that we're making a choice, because really the choice was made for us by
Have you
all of
seen
these
that? Or is
factors.
that sounds like somebody who is a real John Stuart Mill fan? What it seems like they
I
might
think
say that's a straw man.
I think that this is what, and we can dig it out. I think that in the Mill that I was just reading, that he calls it a philosophical necessity, takes it as a given. And I think in this time there was this idea of
That will is actually not that our behavior is mechanistic or deterministic.
deterministic. And I'll pull out that passage at some point, because I'm curious as to how you get to anywhere from there to an ethics.
Yeah.
Seems to me that an ethics presupposes a free will, and that if everything is already set and predetermined, why do we even talking about what anybody should do? Because you can't get from is to ought, right? And I mean, I believe that the argument's wrong on a more fundamental level, that consciousness isn't possible without free will and intentionality, that it's that baked into the pie, as we said, literally into the infinitude of human beingness. And but not in and this is what I think we might have mentioned before, philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, is the nature of subjectivity and experiencing what it's like to be. Again, Thomas Nagel, uh, who I think Claudia mentioned Thomas Nagel in this idea of moral luck. Uh, but he wrote a piece that's very famous and well respected and read, called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And he talks about the echolocation and how different the experience of reality has to be for a bat. We're never going to know what that's like. There's no convolution of mind that we can go through that will know what it's like to be a bat.
I
Now,
did see a little video about a person who taught themselves to echolocate, which
a
is
blind person,
yeah.
I think I might have seen that too.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
wild.
And I wouldn't put out I wouldn't be so quick to rule out the value of shamanic experience in attaining at least an intersubjectivity with some otherness in some way that's informative, that stretches the cognitive model. Like, I think there's a lot of territory there we don't know. Um, but if I did wanna know what another creature experienced reality like, I probably wouldn't pick a bat. I'm just saying. But anyway, so there's a lot of interesting questions, and where does this ethical impulse come from? Is it all society? Is it all, kind of ties into that the legal argument we've referred to before between Hart and Dworkin. Is there an absolute justice, or is it all convention? So you have what was the other thing he was talking about was this difference between the good and the bad, and the right and the wrong, and which is that deontological consequentialist is good and bad purely weighed on, or does right and wrong purely depend on good and bad outcomes, or some things just wrong and some things just right?
Uh-huh.
That's that's another way to say the deontological versus the consequentialist.
It's funny. A guy I follow on X posted a poll, and he posts a lot of stuff that's kind of like socio-political commentary, but this went into philosophy.
Okay.
And it was that if you would be given $1 billion, um, and some adult male somewhere in the world dies, and there are no consequences to you, no jail, no hell, dot dot dot, would you do it? And the
Pure
no
ethical
consequences,
intuition.
is suddenly like the main event of this question. Like, what does that even mean? No consequences. Like, getting $1 billion has consequences. Killing someone has consequences, if only in your own psyche. Like, do you have no memory of it? Like, so I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that there's a
An intuition to an ethical intuition.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. There's a it, it, regardless of external circumstances, whether it be hell or jail, there's an internal consequence to every choice that we make.
yeah.
Maybe not for a sociopath. I don't know, but
And why? Because, say it with me, because, Harry, who we are is determined by the choices that we make, right? And we're here again.
here we are again. Yeah,
Here we are again. And so that is the cost, is the real cost an expression of who we are? That is, the no consequences. You can't be you can't erase the consequence of having made that choice.
yeah.
And so then you are someone who's made that choice,
So
and that's
so
a consequence.
here's something that keeps me up at night occasionally. Um, there's a consequence to having considered making that choice,
Mm,
right? Like if I sit here and entertain the fact that, okay, if there's really no consequence, if morality is entirely relativistic, and I can just turn it off and take the $1 billion and some guy dies, um, just thinking about that, and maybe this is from a shamanic standpoint, is a gateway to kind of an untethering. Do you have any reaction to that? Like, an untethering from morality has consequences also.
well, or maybe having never been tethered in the first place. Um, that your decision in a case like that is really, I think, dependent on your deepest understanding of, we've just expressed it before as WTF. That is to say, your deepest understanding of what is going on here. Because there's a lot of assumptions in that idea. The obvious assumption being first that you'd be better off, better served somehow if you had $1 billion. And there's a lot to explore in that assumption. That kind of touches on our question from last week, which is what is the best life to lead for your hermeneutical process to bring you to the fullest understanding, which is to say, another way, the richest relationship with whatever's going on. And and again, is there an a priori intuition that leads that understanding? And this is like in Plato, it was called anamnesis, which is this idea that we're remembering everything that we didn't. And he shows how just by asking questions, he deduces with a slave boy one of Euclid's theorems. He says, I didn't teach him the theorem. I just asked him questions. And so really he had the knowledge in him. I just helped him remember this knowledge. This is part of the argument. And but that idea of what do we know already? And what is the nature of that intuition? And like we've talked about in hermeneutics, this idea of we don't want to misunderstand. And again, when we use the term understand and not understand, it almost implies a kind of uh Derrida would appreciate this point. It implies that there are two distinct states of understand and not understand. Like our unwitting yin and yang machine and the hidden in language will start to work on that. But in fact, if we drill down into this, we will understand deeper and deeper that understanding is a process. That maybe I hear a song and I get it at one level, and then years go by and I gather life experience, my cognitive model gains nuance, and then I hear that song again and I get an aha around it because I realize there was this deeper level at work at it the whole time that had not revealed itself to me. So a lot of times we have this instinct for future meaning, are seeing the glimpses of the bull, are getting the scent of the game on the wind. But we don't have it yet. But we got something about it. What do we have about it? We have an intuition about it. We have an a priori instinct. We haven't caught the beast, but we have this sense that it's there. And that sense alone says that somehow that thing lives within us already before we actually catch, cook, and eat it. So there's something fascinating there. It reminds me of the movie. There's a movie that I think Carradine did, uh, where the blind seer, the guy, the seeker has this realization, and he says to the blind seer, "How did you know that X, Y, and Z were going to happen? How did you do this or that or this? How did you?" And and Carradine doesn't say anything. And then the guy gets this dawning look on his face of realization, and he says to him, "You've been here before." And Carradine kinda looks at him, and I think he's
I think you muted yourself when you did that.
Are you not hearing me?
There you are. You're back now.
Oh, okay. Good.
So, David Carradine has been here before, and that's where we lost you.
Right. Well, yeah, this idea that there is this instinct, there is an aspect within us that has an intuition, has a preceding understanding of what we're reaching out, what our intentionality reaches out into the universe to discover and to understand. And it reminds me of when Confucius, when in the Wings of the I Ching, when he's talking about how did the ancients make the I Ching, he says they went to the ends of everything on the outside and understood how that all worked. and they went inside as far as one could go inside and understood how that worked. And by understanding how those went together, they were able to lay out the I Ching. If you want to do your own I Ching, I just gave you the formula. You'll want to put a few weekends aside for this, I think.
It might be too late for me to start that project.
Exactly. I on my to-do list. I should point out, though, it's a good time and excuse to, is that, we think of the I Ching and we're often only associate the I Ching with the hexagrams and the divination portion of the I Ching. But there are actually, like a lot of old texts, and I think we've talked about this before, they're with the I Ching, they're called the 10 wings. And the wings, they're included in the Wilhelm version by Bollingen that has the introduction by Carl Jung. That's one of the I Ching versions I recommend highly that people get a hold of. Um, and it's basically attributed to Confucius, where he's trying to explain what's going on with the I Ching. Well, you can't explain what's going on with the I Ching without explaining what's going on with the cosmic Taoist vision of the universe. And so it's a great resource to kind of try to understand or to whet your intuition that there is something there to understand. Maybe you can't quite grasp it yet, but there's something there. It's parallels to Finnegan's Wake. Um, there is something for you to cut your hermeneutical teeth on in here, but it's going to be a bone to chew for a while. It's not going to just give over to you like a gummy bear, right? And meaning is like that sometimes. We have this idea, with scientific stuff. Well, you either understand H2O and water is H2O, or you don't understand that water is H2O, and you can be enlightened on it. And now you have the meaning, and before you didn't have the meaning, and it's like a light switch on, light switch off. But meaning is so dimensional that I think it isn't a discursive on-off phenomenon. It's a growing, and it dimensionalizes, right? With time, it bulges in certain directions, and it gets enriched and saturated by experience, and so that it's very hard to say that we've actually squoze all the juice out of a particular meaning nugget.
Would you say that quantum theory effectively does the same thing for the understanding of H2O that you said might be pretty flattened out and binary? Like you either understand it or you don't. But it seems like now that, and I don't pretend to understand quantum theory, but let's say something like in order for the H molecules and the O molecules to interact, these electrons have to um, uh, be share orbits,
Yep.
and
Darn the luck, the deterministic universe slips out of our fingers again.
those particles are maybe probabilistic
Yeah.
as much as they are physical, and so H2O slips through our fingers, which as it's
It was
wont to
just
do.
another estimation of the shoreline of Norway.
Right, right.
It was just such a big leap over that scribble that we had of the coastline before, that it seemed like it carried so much more information that it gave us so much power that we thought that it's not worth going any deeper. We're so happy with what we've got. And so a few generations went by before that had to get pushed.
So we've sort of come full circle there, right? In coming back to the idea of the infinite, and I've been reminded in this conversation a couple of times that the infinite isn't a separate category from the finite. Rather, the coastline of Norway applies to everything, right? This H2O molecule being the latest example.
All the in between spaces.
Yeah. Um, the in between spaces and each time we turn up the resolution, uh, th- and we we see details that our change the meaning of what we're experiencing.
And if we take Descartes at his word that that infinity is divine and that it actually is at least the footprint of deity, then at every resolution where we turn down or up, what we find somewhere hidden in there is God.
Well, that's a legal argument because the truth is we don't take Descartes at his word. We spent like the first 15 episodes upending Descartes. Um, so,
No, I know.
so we can't give him this one.
Well, I think that the association of infinity with this incapturability, that he takes it all the way to God, might be intuitional. But this idea of the uncapturable, the non-deterministic, the pesky neither live nor dead cat, the and isn't that really just what I said at the beginning with Dewey and this idea of certainty is that certainty doesn't exist in a probabilistic universe. To get to a certainty, we need deterministic universe. And for that to happen, the wave function has to collapse, which is to say that free will has to have made its choice and the choice be taken. And now that the choice has been taken, the math can be done. So when I engage with a probabilistic universe, I am a little probabilistic universe engaging with that outer probabilistic universe. And that's why experience is new.
Is that like an example, or an explanation of how we would interpret, a statement like, "Man was created in God's image"? That a universe of possibility exists in each human before any choice is made?
Yeah, I mean, and the microcosmic macrocosmic argument is, I mean, this gets down to how we are not computers because we're more holographic than a bit or a byte in a processor. Each part has the whole sewn in it in a unique way that does not happen with human inventions, not yet.
That reminds me, Elon tweeted today something to the effect of the event horizon of the singularity, is now on the screen, and I wanted to get your reaction to that.
Say it again.
See if I can find
The
it. He tweets a
singularity.
lot.
See, I think that people don't understand the singularity, or what's implied by it. This idea, as I've understood it, unless I'm really missing something, it sounds like their idea of singularity is we've got a machine that will fool a human into thinking that it's a human. And I'm not sure that that's as relevant as they think that it is, because they're really, really stupid humans. And that AI won't just be another depth of human stupidity because of all the dimensions that it lacks. Like, see, I still think what we've got is a big calculator with a with a huge vocabulary. Um, there to think that a computer will attain intentionality that wasn't just merely human intentionality put in there in the first place is just silliness.
Well, I mean, to kind of take this, this distinction that we've been making in this conversation between a deterministic universe and, what was the alternative to deterministic?
Probabilistic,
Probabilistic. Um,
you know,
AI is by definition deterministic, right?
has to be. It's the switch is either on or it's off. I don't think you're getting away from that. And each switch has no awareness of what any condition of any other switch is. And no switch has a clue of what it being on or it being off means. It's just in a state of electrical excitement or not. And there, and no, this is the fallacy that Fagin said he tried for 3 years until he had the relevant realizations that you can't pile up a bunch of dumb things and get a smart thing out of it, or you can't pile up a bunch of unconscious things and get consciousness out of it. There is a model that says that consciousness is this epiphenomenon on just that just floats on the surface because of how all this hardware operates. And none of those arguments address the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness has not been solved. You'll know that then you'll be able to create live consciousness when they can do that. And the only way I know is the old fashioned way. And if they find a way to do it, it won't be as fun as the old way. So yeah, there's I think we're fooling ourselves. I think a lot of that is PR, that what they've really got is just really smart computers. And I don't understand how exactly a quantum computer works,
Yeah.
but I can assure you that it does not have free will. And human consciousness has free will as a prerequisite for consciousness. It has to have intentionality. That's the best argument that I've heard so far. And it's the one that plugs in with my interpretations of my personal experience. Yeah. My eisegesis. Have you heard of that term? It's
No.
the opposite of exegesis. Exegesis is where you try to get the meaning out of the text. And eisegesis is when you try to find your experience, your personal subjective experience within the text.
Uh-huh.
So they're kind of interesting in a pair of philosophical tools, hermeneutical
Yeah.
enterprises.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like we've touched on ethics a number of times, and I think there were some interesting things touched on, like, whether it's an intuition or just a Darwinian imperative, and if it's an intuition, where might that come from?
Right.
And could there be free will if it's not? And so, but why? And I don't know if this is like the right question to lead us out here, but why does ethics rise to the top? Like, it seems like there are a lot of ways that we could explore our experience of the infinite, and that we could explore our experience of intuition and the source of morality, etc. Why is it this experience of how we treat others that seems to you like where there's some really interesting developmental material to get after?
Right. Well, for me, part of the thing that makes it compelling is because it addresses what do we do? And it addresses what do we do in a way that has that conundrum between the probabilistic and the determinist, right? Because it'd be nice to have a set of rules that is just always, never, and that's sort of the categorical imperative, the deontological thing. But which is sort of like the laws, right? But then we have this particular thing that happened in this particular place on this particular day involving these particular people, and that's where case law comes from. And the judges in that case, or the juries in that case, were trying to apply this timeless, deterministic world, never changing world of law, and apply it to this particular case involving these particular people. And ethics is a version of that also, but we all face it every day. Do you lie to the prisoner? And do you tell him that you'll save his life when you know he's going to get shot just because you know that he may do what you want? And do you now, according to Kant, I believe that Kant had this idea that our moral obligation to other people was to not relate to them in a way that used them. And and I may be low nuancing that, but telling the guy he's not going to get shot when he's going to get shot, and it, that's got to be that's got to qualify. Uh, for Kant's definition there, and so the point is that we each in each new moment of our life face these different questions, and it's the interface of those principles that we carry within us that we've distilled out of the probabilistic events of our lives, right? The happenings of our lives that came out of that who knows what's going to happen probabilistic world. That now we're going to go into this undeterminate, uncertain future with as a set of guidelines to help us understand what should we do and why should we do what we should do, like that. And I think that we are at a time maybe because I've said before that I think history is kind of about this expansion of the individual and the expression of the individual. And that with that expansion, that expression is increased power and increased responsibility. And I think that with the technological revolution that we're riding in now, we have the potential for more discourse, and we also have the potential to take more responsibility. And that if any power we might take on because of this technology, we do at our own peril if we don't step up with the responsibility component that goes along with that power. And so discourse plays an interesting role there. And, I like this idea of the world waking up from history, today's rock and roll reference, Jesus Jones, uh, as also a way of the world sort of knowing itself. And I think through discourse, that's exactly what happened. We talked about the fusion of horizons and that one encounters that happens rather when one builds a bridge through language to another person through discourse, and that this is an idea from Gadamer, and that's where this is a good time for us to put the plug for the show that's coming later on, maybe next week, which we'll be recording after this on Wednesday, which is our follow-up, show with Dr. Claudia Hauer from St. John's College, where we will go into some, a philosopher, who was a student of Martin Heidegger, who believed that ethics was actually a first philosophy. And, in the old world, metaphysics was the first philosophy, and your ethics kind of fell out as an reinforcement of your metaphysical vision.
So I just want to that it's a pretty technical sentence, so I just want to play it back for you with different words
Uh-huh.
and see
Yep.
if I got it. So metaphysics being kind of how the universe works
How it was created,
is the,
how yeah,
yeah,
yep,
it's like how things are, and therefore how we should be about it. And then you're turning that on its head by saying ethics is the first philosophy. It's how should we be about it? How should we treat one another? And then
is
the rest of the philosophical questions, like what is this all about, follows.
yes, and that's the case that Levinas makes, and that I think that Dr. Claudia can explain to us in more detail, and the role of discourse and how it plays within that, and this idea of fusion of horizons was actually Gadamer, who was a fellow student of Heidegger, along with Levinas, and I'm interested in how that shows up with Levinas also. So yeah, so that should be interesting, and that kind of sort of gives us a feel for the different sides of the philosophical argument on ethics, and the bigger questions that it's related to, like free will and consciousness,
Yeah,
and
I think we'll have to save this for another episode, but I'll plant the seed that I'm curious about how we might think about say environmental ethics. There's a better phrase for that from the world of philosophy. Presuming that the infinite also exists in the natural world, and maybe consciousness also exists in the natural world, although it might have some characteristics that are different from how
Yeah,
we experience consciousness. And does that
absolutely.
count as ethics as a first philosophy if we talk about how we relate to the natural world opposed to other human beings? So I'll be curious to
Yeah,
hear more from Claudia about Levinas's take and the infinite in the other, and then maybe we can
yep,
come back to talking about the environment too.
yeah, yeah. And just exactly how big is that concept of the other?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you,
That'll
Brian.
be interesting to see, and I think we're also maybe we'll have some other people chime in on the topic here over the, upcoming
Yeah, and I
weeks.
think more on discourse and dialogue in particular too.
Yeah,
So yeah, we're working on that, and yeah, hopefully we'll have some fun guests coming up here.
sounds good.
Thanks, Brian.